1764, the year Britain asked for payment. In 1764, Britain did not speak in the language of punishment. It spoke in the language of necessity. The war was over, but its costs remained. Britain had emerged victorious across continents, yet victory carried a burden that could not be ignored. The national debt had nearly doubled during the conflict, and interest alone demanded steady, reliable revenue. Maintaining the expanded empire, its borders, its trade routes, its troops, required money long after the fighting ended. From London's perspective, this was not a political problem. It was a financial one. British officials reviewed the empire and asked a straightforward question: where should the money come from? The answer seemed obvious. The American colonies had benefited directly from the war. French power had been removed from their borders. Vast new territories had been secured. Colonial trade flowed under British protection. If the empire existed to provide security and opportunity, then the cost of maintaining it should be shared. This reasoning did not feel radical in Britain. Taxes were a normal feature of British life. Parliament levied them regularly. British citizens paid excise taxes, customs duties, and land taxes as part of their obligation to the state. The idea that colonies would contribute to imperial expenses seemed not only fair, but overdue. What made 1764 different was not the concept of taxation itself. It was the decision to apply it directly. Before this moment, Britain had relied primarily on trade regulation to extract economic value from the colonies. Customs duties existed, but they were designed to guide commerce rather than raise substantial revenue. Enforcement had been uneven. The system depended more on habit and tolerance than strict compliance. That approach no longer seemed sufficient. British officials believed the colonies had matured economically. Population had grown. Trade had expanded. Wealth had accumulated unevenly, but visibly. From London's vantage point, America no longer looked like a fragile frontier. It looked like a productive part of the empire that could shoulder responsibility. This belief shaped policy. In 1764, Britain moved from managing colonial behavior indirectly to funding imperial needs directly. The shift was administrative, deliberate, and framed as reasonable. No crisis was announced. No ultimatum was issued. Instead, Parliament acted as it always had, by legislating. The logic was simple. The empire had paid for colonial security, and now the colonies would help pay for the empire. Colonists did not immediately understand the magnitude of this shift. They were accustomed to regulation. They were accustomed to oversight. They were even accustomed to inconvenience. But direct revenue extraction, designed not to guide trade but to raise money, felt different once it became clear what Britain intended. The distinction mattered. Regulation could be debated as policy. Revenue touched legitimacy. Who had the right to ask for payment? Colonial assemblies had long raised taxes locally. They funded roads, militias, courts, and public works. These taxes were debated, approved, and collected by representatives who lived among the people who paid them. Even when unpopular, they carried the weight of local consent. Imperial taxation operated differently. Parliament did not include colonial representatives. Its members did not answer to colonial voters. Its priorities were shaped by British politics, British debt, and British interests. Colonists respected Parliament's authority in theory, but they had not experienced it as a taxing body acting directly upon them. 1764 brought that possibility into focus. British officials did not believe they were violating colonial rights. In their view, Parliament's authority extended across the empire. Colonists were British subjects. British subjects paid taxes. The mechanism was legitimate. Colonists, however, interpreted legitimacy through experience rather than theory. They asked whether authority without representation could demand money without consent. They asked whether Parliament understood colonial conditions well enough to tax fairly. They asked whether local assemblies would be reduced to administrators of decisions made elsewhere. These questions did not yet form a unified argument. They formed unease. The tone of British policy in 1764 reinforced that unease. Officials spoke openly about enforcement. They emphasized compliance. They made clear that previous tolerance for informal practices had ended. Revenue depended on obedience, and obedience required oversight. This was not framed as hostility. It was framed as responsibility. Britain believed it was asking the colonies to participate fully in the empire they benefited from. Colonists began to wonder whether participation now meant submission rather than partnership. Still, reaction remained measured. Colonists did not erupt in protest. They did not refuse outright. Many believed the measures would be modest, temporary, or adjustable. They assumed that once Britain stabilized its finances, pressure would ease. They trusted that reasoned objections could shape policy. That trust had not yet been broken. But 1764 marked the moment when the empire stopped asking colonies to comply quietly and began asking them to contribute explicitly. The request was financial, but its implications were political. For the first time, Britain was not simply governing the colonies. It was sending them a bill. And once payment is requested, the relationship between authority and obedience is never quite the same. The policy Britain chose to begin this new phase was not dramatic, but it was deliberate. In 1764, Parliament passed what became known in the colonies as the Sugar Act. Its name made it sound narrow, even trivial, a tax on a single commodity, far removed from the everyday concerns of most people. But the Sugar Act was never just about sugar. It was about how authority would now function across the empire. For decades, sugar and molasses had flowed into the American colonies under a web of regulations that existed largely on paper. Previous laws imposed high duties on foreign molasses, particularly from French Caribbean islands, but those duties were so steep that they were rarely enforced. Smuggling was widespread. Colonial merchants built entire trade networks around the assumption that enforcement would be light or negotiable. This arrangement suited everyone, until it didn't. British officials understood that colonial rum production depended heavily on cheap molasses. They also understood that enforcing the old high duties would likely crush colonial trade and provoke resistance. So in 1764, Parliament did something subtle. It lowered the duty on molasses while dramatically increasing enforcement. This was the heart of the Sugar Act. On the surface, it looked like a compromise. Lower rates seemed reasonable. But beneath that surface, the act transformed how the law operated. Customs officials were given stronger authority. Smuggling was treated as a serious offense rather than an inconvenience. New procedures were introduced to ensure compliance. Courts were empowered to prosecute violations more aggressively. Revenue was no longer incidental. It was the point. British officials believed this approach was fair. Lower taxes that were actually collected would raise more money than high taxes that were ignored. Strong enforcement would create predictability. Predictability would stabilize imperial finances. From London, this looked like good governance. In the colonies, It felt like something new entirely. The Sugar Act reached into daily economic life in ways earlier laws had not. Merchants who had operated comfortably in gray areas suddenly faced scrutiny. Ship captains encountered inspections that delayed cargo. Paperwork multiplied. Long-standing informal arrangements collapsed under formal procedure. This was not just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Colonial economies were built on speed, flexibility, and trust. Trade networks relied on relationships as much as on rules. When enforcement tightened, those networks strained. Credit tightened. Prices fluctuated. Small disruptions cascaded outward. Merchants felt this first, but not alone. Rum distillers worried about supply. Sailors worried about employment. Dock workers worried about delays. Shopkeepers worried about prices. The Sugar Act affected far more people than its name suggested. Yet British officials remained confident. They believed the colonies would adapt. After all, British merchants at home operated under strict customs enforcement. Compliance was normal. Why should America be different? This question revealed a growing gap in understanding. British policymakers viewed the colonies as extensions of the imperial system. Colonial experience was expected to align with metropolitan norms. Differences were inefficiencies to be corrected, not conditions to be accommodated. Colonists saw themselves differently. They did not deny Parliament's authority to regulate trade. That authority had long been accepted. What unsettled them was the shift from regulation to revenue, from guidance to extraction. The Sugar Act was not merely shaping behavior, it was demanding money. That distinction mattered deeply. Regulation could be framed as part of imperial coordination. Revenue raised questions of consent. Colonial merchants began asking why Parliament, a body in which they had no representation, could tax their trade directly. They asked why enforcement mechanisms bypassed local courts. They asked why disputes would be resolved in distant admiralty courts without juries. These questions did not yet form a single ideology. They formed a pattern of concern. The Sugar Act also altered how colonists experienced the law itself. Previously, laws that were loosely enforced felt flexible. People could negotiate, delay, or quietly ignore them. Strict enforcement removed that flexibility. The law became something that acted upon colonists rather than something they navigated. This change affected perception as much as practice. When enforcement is consistent, it feels intentional. When it is backed by imperial authority rather than local discretion, it feels imposed. Colonists began to sense that tolerance, once a defining feature of imperial governance, was being replaced by discipline. British officials interpreted colonial reaction as resistance to fairness. They believed colonists were objecting not to principle, but to accountability. Smuggling, from London's view, was theft. Enforcement was justice. Complaints were the predictable reaction of people unaccustomed to obeying rules that now mattered. Colonists rejected that framing. They argued that their economies had developed under Britain's long-standing tolerance. They had invested, traded, and expanded based on the assumption that flexibility was part of the system. Changing enforcement without acknowledging that history felt unfair. More importantly, it felt unilateral. The Sugar Act had been passed without colonial input. It was debated in Parliament without colonial voices. It was enforced by imperial officials who answered to London, not local communities. Colonists did not yet call this tyranny. They called it dangerous. If Parliament could tax trade directly, enforce laws strictly, and bypass local institutions, what would stop it from doing more? The Sugar Act raised not just economic questions, but constitutional ones. Still, reaction remained cautious. Colonial assemblies protested respectfully. Merchants wrote petitions. Pamphlets circulated explaining the act's effects. Arguments emphasized loyalty and shared interest. Colonists insisted they wanted to support the empire, but fairly, and through their own institutions. Britain listened, but did not retreat. From Parliament's perspective, the Sugar Act was modest. The revenue it raised was small compared to the empire's needs. If colonists objected this strongly to a minor measure, what would happen when larger reforms became necessary? That question lingered in London. And in the colonies, another realization took shape. If this was only the beginning, then the empire they had known was already gone. The Sugar Act did not provoke rebellion, but it changed the rules of the relationship. It demonstrated that Britain was willing to tax directly, enforce strictly, and override local practice in the name of imperial necessity. Once that precedent was set, it could not be unseen. And in 1764, colonists began to understand that the bill Britain had sent was not a one-time request. It was a model. What gave the Sugar Act its real force was not the duty itself, but the system built to enforce it. For many colonists, the most unsettling aspect of Britain's new approach in 1764 was not how much money was being collected, but how authority was being exercised. Enforcement revealed intent in ways legislation alone could not. Under the Sugar Act, Britain expanded the use of admiralty courts to handle customs violations. These courts had existed before, but they now took on a far more prominent role. Unlike colonial courts, admiralty courts did not use juries. Cases were decided by judges appointed by the Crown. Proceedings followed maritime law rather than local custom. To British officials, this made sense. Smuggling was an imperial crime, not a local dispute. Colonial juries, they believed, were too sympathetic to merchants accused of violating trade laws. Acquittals were common. Enforcement failed not because the law was unclear, but because local institutions refused to apply it. Admiralty courts solved that problem. They centralized authority. They removed cases from local influence. They ensured consistent outcomes. From London's perspective, this was not an attack on colonial rights. It was a correction to a system that had proven unreliable. Colonists saw something else entirely. Jury trials were not a technical detail to them. They were a cornerstone of English liberty. The right to be judged by one's peers was deeply embedded in colonial political culture. It represented protection against arbitrary power and distant authority. Removing that right felt dangerous. Colonists did not argue that smugglers should go unpunished. They argued that punishment without local consent undermined trust. When judges answered to the Crown and were paid from the fines they imposed, justice felt less like law and more like incentive. This perception mattered. Even colonists who had never smuggled anything began to worry about the precedent. If Parliament could bypass colonial courts in trade cases, what else could it bypass? If jury trials could be removed for economic crimes, could they be removed for other disputes? The issue was no longer sugar. It was power. Enforcement under the Sugar Act also relied on an expanded network of customs officials and informants. Ports were monitored more closely. Warehouses were inspected. Paperwork was scrutinized. The informal understandings that had once smoothed trade disappeared under formal procedure. This created friction not just between colonists and officials, but within colonial communities themselves. Merchants were forced to choose between compliance and profit. Ship captains risked ruin if seized. Sailors faced unemployment when ships sat idle. Informants were rewarded, turning neighbors into potential threats. Trust eroded quietly. British officials viewed these tensions as evidence that enforcement was working. Resistance, they believed, proved necessity. Colonists interpreted the same tensions as proof that the system was breaking something fundamental. Law no longer felt like a shared framework. It felt like a tool used against them. This shift affected how colonists understood authority. Before 1764, imperial power had often been experienced indirectly. Governors negotiated, assemblies debated, compromise was common. Even unpopular policies were softened by distance and discretion. Enforcement removed discretion. When rules are enforced rigidly, intent matters less than compliance. Colonists could no longer rely on negotiation or local influence to resolve disputes. Authority flowed in one direction. This one-way flow altered political conversation. Pamphlets began focusing less on economic inconvenience and more on constitutional principle. Writers asked whether Parliament had the right to impose taxes enforced by courts that denied jury trials. They argued that such practices violated the spirit, if not the letter, of British liberty. These arguments were careful, not radical. Colonists emphasized that they were defending British rights, not rejecting them. They framed their objections as loyalty to tradition rather than defiance of authority. But the content of the debate had changed. Power itself was now under examination. British officials grew impatient with these objections. They believed colonists were confusing privilege with right. From London's view, Parliament was sovereign. Its authority extended across the empire. Courts existed to enforce law, not to reflect local sentiment. This disagreement revealed a deeper divide. Britain defined legitimacy through law passed by Parliament. Colonists increasingly defined legitimacy through consent and custom. In 1764, these definitions had not yet collided openly, but enforcement was pushing them closer together. Each seizure, each court case, each denied jury trial reinforced the sense that Britain was willing to use authority directly rather than persuade. The empire was no longer governing primarily through cooperation. It was governing through mechanisms. That realization did not yet produce resistance on a mass scale. But it changed how colonists listened. Every new policy was now evaluated not just for its content, but for what it revealed about how power would be used in the future. The Sugar Act had introduced taxation. Enforcement revealed the method, and the method mattered more than the money. By the middle of 1764, opposition to Britain's new policies began to take a more recognizable form. It was still cautious. It was still framed in the language of loyalty. But it was no longer isolated. Until this point, colonial reaction to imperial change had largely been local and fragmented. Merchants complained to governors. Assemblies passed resolutions. Pamphlets circulated within individual colonies. Each dispute felt specific, manageable, and contained. The Sugar Act changed that dynamic. Because it affected trade across multiple colonies, merchants in different ports began to recognize shared problems. A seizure in Boston resembled one in New York. An admiralty case in Rhode Island echoed concerns in South Carolina. Enforcement patterns looked the same regardless of location. This similarity mattered. For the first time, colonists began to talk to one another not just as neighbors within a colony, but as participants in a shared imperial problem. Letters crossed colonial boundaries. Merchants compared experiences. Printers reprinted arguments from other ports. A sense of common cause, still fragile, began to form. This did not yet resemble mass protest. It resembled coordination. Merchants were often at the center of this early resistance because they felt the effects first and most directly. Their livelihoods depended on predictable trade and manageable enforcement. When those conditions disappeared, they had both motive and means to respond. They organized petitions. These petitions were not demands. They were arguments. They emphasized loyalty to the Crown and Parliament while outlining the economic damage caused by the Sugar Act's enforcement. They argued that strict regulation would reduce trade, not increase revenue. They warned that disruption in ports would ripple into agriculture and employment. Most importantly, they framed their objections as reasonable corrections, not challenges to authority. Colonial assemblies followed a similar pattern. Resolutions passed in legislative bodies carefully avoided inflammatory language. They affirmed Parliament's role in regulating trade while questioning its authority to raise revenue without colonial consent. They objected to admiralty courts, not because they opposed law enforcement, but because they believed jury trials were essential to justice. These arguments were deliberately conservative. Colonists cited British legal tradition. They referenced precedent. They appealed to rights they believed they already possessed as British subjects. There was no call for independence. There was no rejection of empire. What existed instead was a shared insistence on limits. The most important shift in 1764 was not the intensity of resistance, but its structure. For the first time, colonists were beginning to respond collectively rather than individually. They were testing whether unified, lawful opposition could influence imperial policy. They were discovering common language and common concerns. This coordination was still fragile. Many colonists remained cautious. Some believed resistance was premature. Others feared retaliation. Some colonies were less affected by trade enforcement and saw little reason to risk conflict. The idea that all colonies shared the same interests was not yet fully formed, but the process had begun. Printers played a critical role in this shift. Newspapers reprinted essays from other colonies, allowing arguments to circulate beyond local audiences. Pamphlets explained the Sugar Act in plain language, connecting economic impact to constitutional principle. Readers encountered ideas that felt familiar but now appeared as part of a larger pattern. This expanded conversation mattered because it changed perception. Colonists began to see imperial policy not as a series of isolated measures, but as a direction. Taxation, enforcement, and centralized authority appeared linked. The Sugar Act was no longer just about molasses. It was about how Britain intended to govern. British officials noticed this coordination, but they underestimated its significance. From London's perspective, colonial resistance still appeared manageable. Petitions were polite. Language remained respectful. No violence had occurred. Trade continued. Revenue, though modest, was being collected. Officials interpreted opposition as noise rather than threat. They believed firmness would resolve it. In the colonies, however, something had changed. Colonists had learned that they could organize across boundaries. They had learned that shared grievances produced shared arguments. They had learned that resistance did not have to be loud to be meaningful. This realization did not yet inspire unity or defiance. It inspired confidence. confidence that colonial voices mattered when combined, confidence that lawful opposition could shape outcomes, confidence that the empire's actions could be debated rather than merely endured. By the end of 1764, resistance remained restrained. But it was no longer accidental, it was intentional. And once resistance becomes intentional, it begins to evolve. What mattered most about 1764 was not how much money Britain collected. It was what Britain proved it was willing to do. The Sugar Act did not dramatically change daily life for most colonists overnight. Many people paid little attention to molasses duties or admiralty procedures. Life continued. Trade continued. No crisis erupted. On the surface, the empire appeared stable, but beneath that surface, something irreversible had occurred. For the first time, Parliament had clearly asserted the right to raise revenue from the colonies directly, to enforce that revenue aggressively, and to bypass colonial institutions in the process. This was not regulation designed to shape behavior. It was taxation designed to fund empire. That distinction changed how authority was understood. Colonists had long accepted Parliament's role in regulating trade. They had lived with navigation laws, customs rules, and imperial oversight for generations. Those laws had been unevenly enforced, but their legitimacy was rarely questioned in principle. Regulation was understood as part of belonging to an empire. Revenue was different. Revenue implied obligation without consent. Colonial assemblies had always raised money locally. They debated taxes, adjusted rates, and justified burdens to their constituents. Even unpopular taxes carried legitimacy because they came from representatives who lived among those who paid them. Parliamentary taxation operated outside that relationship. Members of Parliament did not answer to colonial voters. They did not experience colonial conditions firsthand. Their priorities were shaped by British politics, British debt, and British interests. Colonists respected Parliament's authority in theory, but they had never experienced it as a body that taxed them directly. 1764 changed that experience. The Sugar Act established a precedent. Parliament could identify a colonial economic activity, impose a duty designed to raise revenue, enforce it strictly, and justify the entire process as necessary and lawful. Whether the revenue raised was large or small mattered less than the logic behind it. That logic did not remain contained. Colonists began to realize that if Parliament could tax trade, it could tax other things. If it could bypass colonial courts for customs cases, it could bypass them again. If enforcement could be centralized once, it could be centralized further. None of these conclusions required imagination. They followed directly from what had already happened. British officials, meanwhile, drew their own conclusions. From London's perspective, the Sugar Act demonstrated that enforcement could work. Resistance existed, but it remained lawful and limited. Trade continued. Revenue flowed. Colonial protests, though vocal, did not threaten stability. This outcome reinforced British confidence. If colonists objected to a modest measure so intensely, officials reasoned, then the problem was not policy, but expectation. The colonies had grown accustomed to autonomy beyond what empire required. Firmness now would prevent greater disorder later. That belief hardened attitudes. British leaders did not interpret colonial objections as constitutional warnings. They interpreted them as resistance to accountability. In their view, the empire had been too tolerant for too long. Correction was overdue. This difference in interpretation widened the gap between Britain and the colonies without either side fully acknowledging it. Colonists believed they were defending established rights. Britain believed it was restoring proper order. Neither side thought it was escalating. Yet, escalation was happening. What made the moment especially unstable was its quietness. There were no crowds in the streets. No violence forced decisions. No dramatic rupture demanded resolution. Each side could believe it was acting reasonably while slowly committing itself to a path that narrowed options. Colonists adapted rather than revolted. Merchants adjusted routes. Assemblies refined language. Lawyers sharpened arguments. Printers clarified principles. Resistance remained lawful, measured, and framed as loyalty. The system appeared to absorb pressure without breaking. That appearance was deceptive. Pressure absorbed is not pressure resolved. By the time colonists began coordinating objections across colonies, the issue was no longer just the Sugar Act. It was the principle that Parliament had asserted and Britain had defended. The question was no longer whether this law was fair. It was whether this method of governance would continue. British officials assumed it would. Colonists increasingly suspected it would. This mutual expectation shaped everything that followed. By the close of this phase, nothing had collapsed. Trade still moved. Courts still functioned. Assemblies still met. The language of independence was still distant and implausible. But the relationship between authority and consent had shifted. Parliament had acted without colonial approval and enforced its will successfully. Colonists had objected without altering the outcome. Both sides learned something from that exchange. Britain learned that it could proceed. The colonies learned that objection alone might not be enough. That lesson did not produce immediate confrontation. It produced attention. Colonists watched more closely. They read new proposals carefully. They listened for signs that the Sugar Act was an exception or a beginning. What they sensed, even if they could not yet prove it, was that Britain had crossed a line of practice, if not of law. A precedent had been set, and once precedent exists, the next step rarely feels isolated. It feels expected. By the time the Sugar Act was fully in effect, it had become clear that Britain did not see 1764 as an experiment. It saw it as a beginning. From London's perspective, the first phase of reform had worked. Revenue, though modest, was being collected. Enforcement mechanisms were functioning. Colonial protests, while persistent, remained lawful and restrained. No violence had erupted. Trade continued. The empire had asserted authority, and the system had absorbed the pressure without collapsing. That outcome encouraged confidence. British officials did not interpret colonial objections as evidence that the policy was flawed. They interpreted them as evidence that the colonies were adjusting to a new reality. Resistance, they believed, was the natural response of a population unaccustomed to accountability. With time and firmness, compliance would follow. So pressure did not ease. It continued. Customs enforcement remained strict. Admiralty courts continued to hear cases without juries. Officials were instructed to pursue violations consistently, not selectively. Governors were reminded that imperial priorities now took precedence over local accommodation. This continuity mattered. Colonists had hoped that the Sugar Act might be temporary, a short-term response to debt that would be revised once revenue stabilized. As months passed with no sign of retreat, that hope weakened. What felt at first like adjustment began to feel like direction. Britain was not testing limits. It was establishing them. Colonists experienced this persistence in daily, practical ways. Merchants who expected enforcement to relax found inspections just as frequent. Legal challenges produced few reversals. Appeals moved slowly, if at all. The system appeared designed not to negotiate, but to endure. That endurance altered perception. Colonists began to realize that protesting individual laws might not be enough. If Britain was committed to a broader transformation of imperial governance, then each measure was less important than the pattern they formed together. The Sugar Act was no longer seen as an isolated law. It was seen as part of a trajectory. This realization did not produce panic. It produced calculation. Colonial leaders began reassessing strategy. Merchants debated whether petitions were sufficient. Assembly members questioned how far respectful objection could go before it lost effectiveness. Printers sharpened arguments, shifting from complaints about economic harm to discussions of constitutional principle. None of this happened suddenly. It unfolded quietly across letters, meetings, and publications. British officials noticed this shift but misread it. From London's view, colonial discourse appeared increasingly theoretical and detached from practical governance. Officials believed colonists were elevating abstract arguments to avoid responsibility. They assumed that once economic disruption settled and trade adapted, opposition would fade. This assumption underestimated the effect of continuity. Pressure applied briefly can be tolerated. Pressure applied steadily forces re-evaluation. As enforcement continued, colonists adjusted their expectations. They stopped waiting for reversal and began asking what came next. If Britain had taxed trade, would it tax other transactions? If courts could bypass juries in customs cases, would that logic spread? If Parliament acted without colonial consent once, would it do so again? These questions did not yet have answers, but they now felt reasonable. British policy in 1764 had introduced a new rhythm to colonial life, one in which authority pressed forward methodically, without dramatic escalation, but without retreat. The empire was no longer improvising, it was implementing. This methodical approach reduced the chance of immediate rebellion, but it increased long-term tension. Colonists could not point to a single moment of injustice. Instead, they faced a series of decisions that, taken together, narrowed autonomy. That narrowing was subtle. Local governments still functioned. Colonial courts still heard most cases. Assemblies still met and debated. The outward forms of self-governance remained intact. What changed was the ceiling. Colonists began to sense that there were limits beyond which their institutions could no longer operate independently. Certain decisions were no longer theirs to make. Certain objections no longer altered outcomes. This sense of containment mattered deeply. Political cultures shaped by participation react strongly when participation feels constrained. Even when authority is lawful, its reach becomes more visible when it overrides custom. As pressure continued, colonists became more attentive to language. They noticed how British officials framed obedience as duty rather than agreement. They observed how enforcement was described as neutral rather than negotiable. They recognized that flexibility, once a defining feature of imperial governance, was disappearing. Britain, for its part, believed it was acting responsibly. Officials argued that empire required consistency. Allowing exceptions invited chaos. If Parliament's authority was legitimate, then enforcing its laws firmly was not oppression, but governance. The colonies, they believed, would eventually recognize this logic. This belief hardened policy. Instead of reconsidering the approach, Britain prepared to expand it. Plans were discussed quietly. Revenue models were examined. Legal frameworks were reviewed. The Sugar Act was treated not as a final measure, but as proof of concept. Colonists did not yet know the details of what Britain was considering, but they could feel the direction. Pressure had not produced collapse. It had produced attention, and attention, once focused, rarely drifts away. As the year continued, colonists entered a new phase of awareness. They no longer waited for policy to end. They watched for what would follow. The empire had demonstrated that it could press forward calmly, legally, and persistently. The question now was not whether pressure would continue. It was how far it would go. As British pressure continued without retreat, colonial opposition began to change in character. Earlier objections had focused on consequences. Merchants described losses. Assemblies warned of disruption. Pamphlets explained how enforcement damaged trade. These arguments assumed that if Britain understood the effects of its policies, it would revise them. By the latter half of 1764, that assumption weakened. Colonists began to recognize that British officials understood the consequences and accepted them. Enforcement was not producing unintended harm. It was producing intended control. Once that realization took hold, colonial arguments shifted away from outcomes and toward principles. This was a subtle but critical transformation. Instead of asking whether the Sugar Act worked, colonists began asking whether Parliament had the right to impose it in the first place. Instead of debating enforcement methods, they debated authority itself. Economic inconvenience gave way to constitutional concern. Writers returned to familiar ground: English political tradition. Pamphlets cited the rights of Englishmen, emphasizing consent, representation, and the protection of property. These were not new ideas. They had circulated for generations. What changed was how directly they were applied to imperial policy. Colonists argued that taxation and representation were inseparable. Parliament, they acknowledged, held authority over the empire. But that authority, they insisted, had limits. Taxes raised without colonial consent violated the principles Britain claimed to uphold. This argument was careful. Colonists did not deny Parliament's existence or legitimacy. They did not claim independence. They did not reject empire. Instead, they insisted that empire functioned best when authority respected established rights. They framed resistance as preservation, not rebellion. This framing mattered because it allowed opposition to broaden without radicalizing. Farmers, lawyers, printers, and clergy could engage with constitutional arguments even if they were not directly affected by trade enforcement. The debate moved beyond ports and into towns and meeting houses. Lawyers played a central role in this shift. Trained in English legal tradition, they articulated objections with precision. They explained how jury trials protected liberty. They outlined how taxation without representation undermined property rights. They emphasized precedent, arguing that Britain itself had resisted similar practices in the past. These arguments gave structure to unease. What had felt like discomfort now felt like contradiction. Colonists believed Britain was acting against its own principles. That belief strengthened opposition while preserving loyalty. Printers amplified these ideas. Newspapers published essays that dissected parliamentary authority. Pamphlets circulated explanations of natural rights and constitutional limits. Arguments were written not to inflame, but to persuade. Language remained measured, legalistic, and restrained. This restraint was strategic. Colonists understood that overt defiance would invite repression. By grounding their arguments in British tradition, they positioned themselves as defenders of the Constitution rather than challengers to it. They sought to force Britain to confront the inconsistency between its ideals and its actions. British officials were aware of these arguments and largely dismissed them. From London's perspective, colonial writers misunderstood sovereignty. Parliament, officials insisted, was supreme. Representation existed virtually through shared British identity. Colonial assemblies were subordinate bodies, not equals. This doctrine of virtual representation had long existed, but it now moved from theory to justification. British leaders argued that many people in Britain itself lacked direct representation, yet were still taxed. Colonists, they claimed, were no different. Parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, even if individuals did not vote for its members. Colonists rejected this logic. They argued that representation required proximity and accountability. A representative who did not live among the people taxed could not understand their circumstances. Consent, they insisted, could not be virtual. This disagreement hardened positions. Each side believed it was defending constitutional truth. Britain emphasized parliamentary sovereignty. Colonists emphasized consent and rights. Neither framework fully acknowledged the other. As arguments sharpened, tone shifted slightly. While still respectful, colonial writings became more confident. Authors no longer asked whether Parliament might reconsider. They argued that Parliament must reconsider. The language of request gave way to the language of obligation. This shift did not produce unity overnight. Some colonists remained cautious. Others worried that constitutional arguments went too far. Merchants still hoped for compromise. Many believed Britain would adjust once revenue stabilized. But the intellectual groundwork was being laid. Colonists were learning how to argue against authority without rejecting it. They were building a shared vocabulary that could travel across colonies. They were discovering that opposition could be principled, organized, and sustained. This mattered because ideas outlast laws. The Sugar Act might be revised or repealed. Enforcement might fluctuate. But constitutional arguments, once articulated and shared, did not disappear when policies changed. They shaped how future actions were interpreted. British officials underestimated this effect. They believed that ideas would fade if material conditions improved. They focused on compliance rather than conviction. They assumed that order depended on enforcement, not agreement. Colonists were moving in the opposite direction. They increasingly believed that agreement mattered more than obedience. Laws imposed without consent might be enforced, but they would never be legitimate. This belief did not yet produce confrontation. It produced clarity. Colonists began to see their relationship with Britain less as a series of isolated disputes and more as a question of structure. Who decided? Who consented? Who bore obligation? And on what terms? These questions sharpened political awareness across the colonies. By the time the year progressed further, resistance no longer depended solely on merchants or specific laws. It rested on arguments that any colonist could understand and repeat. The debate had moved from ports to principles. Britain had asked for payment. Colonists were now asking for justification. And once justification is demanded, authority must either explain itself or enforce itself more forcefully. As arguments sharpened within individual colonies, another shift quietly followed. Colonists began to recognize that ideas carried farther when they moved together. Earlier resistance had been local by default. Merchants spoke to governors. Assemblies addressed Parliament individually. Pamphlets circulated within familiar networks. Even when colonists shared grievances, they experienced them as separate problems unfolding in separate places. By late 1764, that pattern began to change. Letters moved more frequently between colonies. Merchants compared enforcement practices across ports. Lawyers exchanged arguments and precedents. Printers reprinted essays not because they were local, but because they were relevant elsewhere. This exchange was not yet centralized. There was no single organization coordinating resistance. No Congress met. No unified strategy was announced. What existed instead was recognition. The understanding that what happened in one colony mattered to others. That understanding altered behavior. Colonists began to frame their objections in broader terms. Instead of describing how a policy harmed Massachusetts or Rhode Island, they described how it affected the colonies. Language shifted subtly but meaningfully. Problems were no longer isolated incidents. They were shared conditions. This mattered because shared conditions invite shared solutions. Coordination did not require unanimity. Colonies differed in economic structure, political culture, and immediate impact. Some depended heavily on trade. Others were less exposed. But the constitutional arguments emerging in 1764 applied everywhere. Taxation without consent did not depend on port activity. Admiralty courts did not affect only smugglers. Parliamentary authority did not stop at colonial borders. As these ideas circulated, colonists began to see themselves less as individual communities negotiating with Britain and more as participants in a collective relationship with imperial power. That perception was new. For generations, colonial identity had been layered. People identified first with their town, then their colony, and only distantly with other colonies. Cooperation existed, but it was episodic and driven by necessity rather than principle. 1764 introduced principle as a unifying force. Printers played an essential role in this transformation. Newspapers increasingly published essays written elsewhere. Pamphlets were reissued with minimal alteration. Arguments gained authority not because of who wrote them, but because they appeared in multiple places. Familiar ideas became shared ideas. Readers encountered perspectives that mirrored their own concerns but came from distant colonies. This produced a subtle shift in trust. If people in different places experienced the same problems, then those problems felt less personal and more structural. Structural problems invite structural responses. Colonial leaders took note. Assembly members began referencing debates in other colonies. Merchants cited enforcement actions beyond their own ports. Lawyers used examples from distant courts to illustrate broader trends. These references did not yet produce coordination in action, but they produced coordination in understanding. That understanding lowered barriers. Colonists who might have hesitated to object alone felt more confident knowing others shared their concerns. Arguments gained weight through repetition. Patterns replaced anecdotes. British officials observed this circulation of ideas but underestimated its significance. From London's perspective, colonial resistance still lacked organization. There were no mass demonstrations, no refusal to comply, no unified demands. Officials believed coordination required leadership and structure, neither of which appeared fully formed. They mistook absence of organization for absence of alignment. What was emerging in 1764 was not a movement, but a network. Networks do not announce themselves. They develop quietly, through repetition and recognition. They rely on shared language rather than centralized control. By the time they become visible, they are often already established. Colonists were building such a network through conversation rather than command. This network changed expectations. Colonists began to assume that new imperial measures would affect more than one colony. They anticipated shared responses. They looked outward as well as inward when evaluating policy. The idea of collective consequence became part of political calculation. This shift did not erase differences. Colonies still disagreed about priorities. Some favored accommodation. Others favored firmer resistance. Economic interests diverged. Political cultures clashed. But the sense that they were facing the same imperial authority under similar conditions began to outweigh those differences. Coordination also changed the tone of resistance. Arguments became more disciplined. Writers avoided language that might isolate one colony from another. They emphasized principles that could apply everywhere. The goal was not to inflame, but to align. This discipline reflected growing awareness. Colonists understood that unity increased legitimacy. Britain could dismiss isolated complaints. It could not as easily ignore a shared constitutional argument repeated across the empire. Still, this coordination remained cautious. Colonists did not yet seek confrontation. They did not claim sovereignty. They did not reject Parliament outright. Instead, they tested whether shared reasoning could influence imperial policy. This test required patience. Networks take time to mature. Trust builds gradually. The circulation of ideas precedes coordinated action. In 1764, colonists were still learning how to listen to one another across distance. But that learning mattered. It prepared them to respond more quickly when new policies arrived. It created channels through which information could move. It established habits of comparison and consultation. British officials, focused on enforcement and revenue, did not fully appreciate this development. They believed order depended on compliance. They believed coordination required leadership. They believed that without organization, resistance would dissipate. Colonists were proving otherwise. They were discovering that shared understanding could exist without centralized control, that agreement could form without formal meetings, that unity could grow quietly. This discovery did not yet change outcomes. Britain continued its policies. Enforcement remained firm. No concessions were offered. The empire moved forward according to its plan. But the colonies were no longer reacting in isolation. They were watching together. And when people begin watching together, their responses begin to change. Not immediately, but inevitably. By the time new measures were discussed in London, colonists were better prepared to recognize them as part of a pattern rather than as surprises. Coordination had not produced resistance yet. It had produced readiness. And readiness alters the balance of power long before action does. As colonial coordination deepened, Britain did not slow its pace. It held its course. From London's perspective, there was little reason to reconsider the direction set in 1764. The Sugar Act had established authority without provoking disorder. Revenue was being collected. Enforcement mechanisms were functioning. Colonial objections, though increasingly articulate, remained confined to paper and debate. No lines had been crossed. British officials interpreted this outcome as confirmation that their approach was sound. Firmness, they believed, had stabilized the system. Any retreat now would only encourage further resistance. Consistency, not compromise, was the lesson drawn from the year. Parliamentary debates reflected this confidence. Members acknowledged colonial dissatisfaction, but they framed it as misunderstanding rather than injustice. The colonies, they argued, had grown accustomed to indulgence. Reasserting authority was not a violation of rights, but a return to proper governance. If the empire was to function effectively, it could not allow local preference to override imperial necessity. This logic rested on sovereignty. In Britain, parliamentary sovereignty was the cornerstone of political order. Parliament did not share authority, it exercised it. Limits on its power came from tradition and prudence, not from subordinate bodies. Colonial assemblies in this framework existed to manage local affairs, not to veto imperial decisions. Colonial arguments about consent and representation were therefore dismissed as misplaced. British officials maintained that representation did not require direct participation. The doctrine of virtual representation provided a convenient justification. Parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, even if individuals or regions did not elect its members. Colonists, like many British subjects at home, were represented in theory rather than in fact. This doctrine resolved the issue neatly for Britain. It did not resolve it for the colonies. Still, Britain pressed forward. Officials did not announce sweeping new measures publicly. Instead, they worked methodically. They reviewed revenue streams. They evaluated enforcement capacity. They discussed how to expand the principles tested under the Sugar Act to other areas of colonial life. The absence of dramatic announcements was intentional. British leaders believed gradual implementation reduced risk. Each measure could be defended individually. Resistance would remain fragmented. Over time, colonists would adapt to the new normal. This strategy depended on one assumption: that resistance would remain passive. In Britain's experience, populations adjusted to taxation once enforcement was consistent. Initial complaints faded as compliance became routine. Officials expected the same pattern in America. They underestimated the colonial context. Unlike Britain, the colonies had long governed themselves in practical terms. Assemblies had real power. Courts operated locally. Enforcement relied on negotiation as much as authority. Colonists were accustomed to participating in governance rather than merely submitting to it. By holding course without addressing colonial arguments, Britain unintentionally reinforced colonial suspicion. Each refusal to reconsider policy confirmed the belief that local voices no longer mattered. Each enforcement action without concession suggested that the empire was less interested in agreement than in obedience. British officials saw strength. Colonists saw distance. This divergence in interpretation widened quietly. What made the moment especially unstable was the absence of immediate consequences. Britain did not face rebellion. Colonists did not face repression beyond enforcement. Both sides could believe time was on their side. In Britain, confidence hardened. Officials began treating colonial opposition as predictable noise rather than meaningful dissent. They assumed that legal arguments would lose force once material conditions stabilized. The focus remained on revenue, order, and precedent. In the colonies, patience thinned. Colonists did not abandon loyalty. They did not reject empire. But they began to doubt whether argument alone could influence policy. If Britain was determined to proceed regardless of colonial consent, then the methods of resistance might need to change. This doubt remained unspoken. Public language stayed restrained. Petitions remained respectful. Assemblies avoided inflammatory resolutions. But beneath that restraint, calculation increased. Colonists were watching how Britain responded not just to this law, but to the idea of objection itself. They were learning what forms of resistance were ignored and which, if any, produced results. Britain, by holding course, taught an unintended lesson. It taught colonists that reasoned protest by itself might not be enough. That lesson did not immediately translate into action. It translated into preparation. As officials in London continued refining their plans, colonists began anticipating what those plans might be. They asked what would happen if Britain moved beyond trade and into everyday transactions. They wondered whether the methods tested under the Sugar Act would be expanded rather than abandoned. These questions did not yet produce answers, but they shaped expectation. Britain believed it was managing a problem. The colonies increasingly believed they were being managed. This difference mattered. When authority insists on consistency, it limits its ability to adjust. When populations sense that adjustment is no longer possible, they begin exploring alternatives. By continuing forward without engagement, Britain closed off some paths even as it opened others. The year was not yet over. No decisive moment had arrived, but the direction was now clear. Britain would not reverse itself easily, and the colonies were beginning to understand what that meant. By the later months of 1764, the effects of Britain's decisions were no longer abstract. They had begun to settle into daily life. The Sugar Act was being enforced. Admiralty courts were active. Customs officials operated with confidence rather than caution. What had once felt like a series of adjustments now felt like a system taking root. For many colonists, this was the moment when uncertainty hardened into recognition. They had waited for signs of flexibility. They had expected enforcement to ease once revenue stabilized. They had hoped that careful argument and respectful protest would prompt reconsideration. Instead, Britain's approach remained steady. This steadiness carried consequences. Merchants altered their calculations. Some reduced trade. Others raised prices. Credit tightened. Risk increased. Even colonists who never touched foreign molasses felt the effects indirectly as costs shifted and availability changed. But the most important consequences were political rather than economic. Colonists had learned something about the nature of imperial authority. They had learned that Parliament was willing to legislate directly, enforce consistently, and proceed without colonial consent. They had learned that constitutional arguments, however carefully framed, did not produce immediate results. They had learned that loyalty and restraint did not guarantee influence. None of this produced despair. It produced clarity. Colonists began reassessing assumptions that had shaped their relationship with Britain for generations. They reconsidered what representation meant. They questioned whether rights could exist without enforcement mechanisms they controlled. They debated whether participation in governance required more than petitioning a distant authority. These debates did not remain confined to elites. While lawyers and assembly members articulated arguments, ordinary colonists absorbed their implications. Church sermons touched on justice and authority. Tavern conversations turned toward rights and obligations. Political language, once specialized, became familiar. This diffusion mattered. Ideas that circulate widely become harder to contain. When people across social classes share a vocabulary of grievance, resistance gains durability even if it remains restrained. At the same time, divisions persisted. Not all colonists agreed on the severity of the situation. Some believed Britain would still adjust. Others argued that confrontation was dangerous and unnecessary. Economic interests varied, and so did tolerance for risk. These divisions slowed escalation. They prevented unity from hardening too quickly. They kept resistance cautious and lawful. They preserved the possibility of reconciliation. Britain interpreted this caution as weakness. Officials in London believed colonial opposition lacked resolve. They saw no coordinated refusal to comply, no disruption that threatened imperial stability. From their perspective, the system was working as intended. This reinforced their confidence. Plans discussed quietly earlier in the year began to take clearer shape. If trade could be taxed and enforced successfully, perhaps other forms of revenue were possible. If colonial arguments did not disrupt governance, perhaps they could be ignored. The Sugar Act was no longer the focus. It was the foundation. Colonists sensed this shift even without knowing specifics. They began to anticipate rather than react. They paid closer attention to parliamentary debates. They watched for language that suggested expansion rather than restraint. They measured each policy not on its own terms, but as part of a developing pattern. This pattern felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Britain was not seeking compromise. It was building a model. The realization that Britain was acting systematically rather than experimentally changed colonial calculations. If pressure was not temporary, then patience had limits. If objection was ineffective, then strategy mattered. Still, restraint held. There were no calls for separation, no rejection of monarchy, no demand for independence. The idea of breaking from Britain remained distant, even unthinkable for most. But the space between loyalty and submission was narrowing. Colonists still considered themselves British subjects. They still valued British law. They still believed in the empire's promise. Yet, they increasingly questioned whether that promise included their consent. This tension did not explode. It settled. And settled tensions shape behavior differently than sudden crises. They encourage planning rather than panic. They foster preparation rather than reaction. They allow people to imagine alternatives without yet committing to them. By the time the year approached its close, the colonies had changed in ways that were not immediately visible. They were more attentive. They were more informed. They were more connected. They had learned how to argue collectively, how to recognize patterns, and how to interpret imperial action through principle rather than convenience. Britain, meanwhile, had learned something too. It had learned that authority could be asserted without immediate consequence, that enforcement could proceed without collapse, that resistance, when restrained, could be absorbed. Both sides believed they were in control. Both were mistaken in different ways. What had begun in 1764 as a question of revenue had become a question of governance. What had started as an administrative adjustment had reshaped expectations on both sides of the Atlantic. The relationship had not broken, but it no longer rested on the same assumptions. By the time the year drew near its end, the colonies were not facing revolution. They were facing a future that looked increasingly unfamiliar, and unfamiliar futures demand decisions, even when no one is ready to make them yet. End of the year, 1764.